The tape begins with static, then a voice cuts through. It's calm, measured, almost soothing. Jim Jones speaks to his followers as if explaining something simple, something necessary. He tells them that death is not their enemy. He calls it an act of revolutionary suicide, a beautiful stepping over to another plane. And then, beneath his words, you hear it. The sound that makes your blood freeze. Children crying, babies screaming, voices pleading in the background, growing more desperate as the minutes tick by. On November 18, 1978, 918 people died in a jungle clearing in Guyana, South America. It happened in a single afternoon. Among the dead were 304 children, some just infants, too young to understand the cups being pressed to their lips. The compound was called Jonestown, named after the man whose voice commanded them to drink. The poison was cyanide mixed with grape-flavored drink powder, and it killed quickly, but not peacefully. Survivors who escaped described convulsions, foam coming from mouths, the sounds of people choking and gasping as their bodies shut down. This is the story of how it happened, how a preacher from Indiana convinced nearly 1,000 Americans to follow him into the jungle, how devotion became obsession, how paradise became a prison, and how one man's paranoia led to the largest mass death of American civilians until September 11, 2001. In the fading light of rural Indiana, in a shabby house on the outskirts of Lynn, a boy named Jim Jones learned early that the world was divided into those who had power and those who suffered under it. Born on the 13th of May 1931, during the depths of the Great Depression, Jones grew up in circumstances that would have broken many children. His father, James Thurman Jones, returned from the First World War a broken man, poisoned by mustard gas and consumed by the Ku Klux Klan's hateful ideology. His mother, Lynetta, worked whatever job she could find, leaving young Jim to wander the streets of Lynn largely unsupervised, a ghost child in a town that barely noticed he existed. The neighbors would later remember him as strange, unsettling even in childhood. He conducted elaborate funeral services for dead animals, delivering passionate sermons over the bodies of cats and dogs he found along the roadside. He demanded that other children attend these macabre ceremonies, and those who refused faced his explosive anger. One childhood acquaintance recalled how Jones once stabbed a cat repeatedly with a stick, then wept over its body, cradling it like a lost friend. This pattern, this cycle of cruelty followed by performative compassion, would become the blueprint for everything that followed. But young Jones also discovered something else in those lonely Indiana years. He found that he could talk, really talk, and people would listen. He attended different churches around Lynn, sampling them like a consumer testing products, studying the preachers and their techniques. He noticed how certain words made people lean forward in their pews, how a crack in the voice at just the right moment could bring tears to their eyes. By his teenage years, Jones was already preaching on street corners, his voice carrying an intensity that seemed far too large for his thin frame. In 1949, Jones enrolled at Indiana University Bloomington, but formal education couldn't contain his ambitions. He married a nurse named Marceline Baldwin, a woman who would stand beside him through decades of increasingly dark transformation. Together they moved to Indianapolis, where Jones found work at a hospital while beginning his true calling. He started attending a Methodist church, but quickly grew frustrated with what he saw as their timid approach to racial justice. This was the 1950s in Indiana, where segregation was enforced not just by law but by brutal social custom, and Jones saw an opportunity. He opened his first church, calling it the Community Unity Church, in a rented space in a predominantly white neighborhood. From the beginning, Jones did something that was genuinely radical for the time and place. He welcomed black families, not just as token attendees, but as full members of the congregation. He preached a strange hybrid theology that mixed Pentecostal enthusiasm with socialist politics and his own bizarre mythology. He claimed to be the reincarnation of various historical figures, including Lenin and Jesus Christ, though in these early years he kept such pronouncements relatively quiet, testing the waters. But here is where the story becomes more complex, where the simple narrative of a monster in the making meets the uncomfortable truth that Jim Jones actually did some good in the world. His early work in Indianapolis was genuinely progressive. He and Marceline became the first white couple in the city to adopt a black child. They eventually adopted 7 children of various races, calling them their rainbow family, and for many in the community, this seemed like living proof of Jones's commitment to racial equality. He integrated Indianapolis restaurants and movie theaters through a combination of persistence and publicity stunts. He pressured church members to bring black friends to establishments that refused to serve them, then documented the refusals to the local newspapers. Jones opened a soup kitchen that fed hundreds of people every week. He established a free health clinic. He visited the elderly and the sick, sitting with them for hours when no one else would. Former members from this era speak of genuine kindness they witnessed, real compassion that seemed to flow from Jones in those moments. This is the difficulty, the cognitive dissonance that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The monster was also, sometimes, genuinely helpful. The man who would eventually orchestrate the largest mass murder-suicide in modern American history started by feeding hungry people and fighting against segregation. In 1956, Jones renamed his growing congregation the People's Temple Christian Church Full Gospel. And it was around this time that he discovered his most powerful tool, faith healing. He had watched other Pentecostal preachers perform these theatrical miracles, and Jones, ever the student, understood that faith healing wasn't about God at all. It was about performance, about creating an experience so overwhelming that people's critical thinking simply shut down. His early healings were crude. He would have members of his staff plant themselves in the audience, then dramatically call them forward and cure their ailments. Cancer tumors, he claimed, would fall from people's bodies into his waiting hands. But these tumors were chicken livers and gizzards that Jones palmed with increasing skill. He studied stage magic, practicing sleight of hand for hours. He had members of his inner circle, his planning commission as he would later call them, research audience members before services, gathering personal details that Jones would then reveal as divine knowledge. The healings worked. People flocked to see this young preacher who could apparently cure cancer, arthritis, blindness, and deafness. They brought their sick relatives, their dying children, their last desperate hope. And Jones, hopped up on amphetamines that he took to maintain his grueling schedule, would pace the stage for hours, sweat pouring down his face, calling out names and ailments, producing bloody tissue that he claimed were tumors extracted by the power of God working through him. Behind the scenes, Jones was already showing signs of the paranoia and megalomania that would consume him. He began to claim that he alone could protect his followers from the nuclear war that he insisted was imminent. This was the height of the Cold War, and fears of atomic annihilation were widespread, but Jones used these fears like a weapon. He told his congregation that he had visions of cities burning, of nuclear fireballs consuming America, and that only those who followed him completely would survive. In 1965, Jones read an article in Esquire magazine that listed the safest places in the world to survive a nuclear war. Northern California made the list. Jones claimed to have a divine revelation about this, though the divine revelation was apparently literate and subscribed to magazines. He moved a core group of about 70 families to Redwood Valley in Mendocino County, California, establishing a new People's Temple headquarters far from the prying eyes of Indianapolis skeptics. But Jones understood that rural Redwood Valley, isolated as it was, would not give him the power and influence he craved. So he expanded to Ukiah, and then, critically, to San Francisco. In San Francisco during the 1970s, Jim Jones found exactly the environment he needed to thrive. The city was a cauldron of progressive politics, social experimentation, and genuine desire for change. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the sexual revolution, all of it created an atmosphere where traditional authority was questioned and new forms of community were embraced. Jones presented the People's Temple as the vanguard of this new world. His services in San Francisco were spectacular production. Buses would bring in hundreds of members, predominantly African-American families from poor neighborhoods, and they would fill whatever venue Jones had rented. They sang, they testified, they watched in awe as Jones performed his healings. Politicians who attended saw something that looked like genuine grassroots power, a multiracial coalition of dedicated activists who could knock on doors, register voters, and turn out for rallies. Harvey Milk, the pioneering gay rights activist and city supervisor, appeared at People's Temple events. Willie Brown, the powerful state assemblyman who would later become mayor of San Francisco, spoke glowingly of Jones and his work. First Lady Rosalind Carter met with Jones and was photographed shaking his hand. The liberal establishment of San Francisco embraced Jim Jones because what they saw appeared to be exactly what they believed in: an integrated congregation, led by a white preacher, fighting for social justice and political change. Jones was appointed to the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. He won the Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award. Newspaper articles praised his work with the poor and his commitment to racial equality. The People's Temple ran nursing homes, operated programs for drug addicts, and continued to feed thousands of people every week. On paper, in the public eye, Jim Jones was a successful progressive minister, doing exactly the kind of work that a compassionate society should support. But behind this facade, the darkness was spreading. Jones was consuming massive quantities of drugs, particularly barbiturates and amphetamines, which fueled his increasingly paranoid and erratic behavior. He began demanding what he called catharsis sessions, where members were forced to confess their sins in front of the entire congregation. These sessions could last for hours, with Jones berating and humiliating people for minor infractions. Physical punishment became routine. Children were beaten with paddles. Adults were placed in a boxing ring and forced to fight trained temple guards while the congregation watched. Jones developed an obsession with loyalty tests. He made members sign blank sheets of paper that could later be turned into false confessions to crimes they never committed. He demanded that they turn over their property, their savings, their social security checks. He separated families, sending children to live with other temple members to break the bonds of family loyalty and replace them with loyalty to him alone. He began to preach what he called apostolic socialism, claiming that God was actually a principle of love, not a being, and that he, Jim Jones, was the manifestation of that principle. The sexual abuse began, or perhaps escalated, during this period. Jones claimed that he needed to have sex with both women and men in the congregation to break down their attachments to capitalist concepts of monogamy and possessiveness. He humiliated his wife Marceline publicly, forcing her to listen as he described his affairs with other women in graphic detail during services. He began to claim that he was the only true heterosexual man in the temple, and that any man who showed interest in women was simply copying Jones himself. The logic was insane, but logic had long since ceased to matter. The first defectors started to appear. Families who had given everything to the temple realized they had joined something far more sinister than a progressive church. They spoke of beatings, of forced labor, of children being abused. But Jones had prepared for this. He had cultivated relationships with politicians and journalists. He had his members write letters to newspapers, praising the temple whenever critical articles appeared. He dismissed defectors as traitors, as people who couldn't handle the discipline required to build a new society. And here is the most chilling part. Many people who heard these defector stories simply didn't believe them. How could this man who fed the poor, who fought against racism, who won humanitarian awards, how could he also be a megalomaniacal abuser? The cognitive dissonance was too great. It was easier to believe that the defectors were lying, that they were disgruntled former members with axes to grind, than to accept that both things could be true simultaneously. By 1977, Jones faced increasing scrutiny. A magazine called New West was preparing a major expose. Former members were speaking more loudly, sharing more details. Jones made a decision. He would move the bulk of his congregation to the agricultural project he had been developing in the jungles of Guyana, a small socialist country on the northern coast of South America. He called it Jonestown, and he promised his followers it would be a socialist paradise, a place where they could live free from the racism and capitalism of America. Nearly 1,000 people followed him into the jungle, leaving behind everything they knew. Why? They were about to discover that the warning signs, the red flags that had been waving for years, were not aberrations, but previews of something far worse than anyone could have imagined. The man who started by holding funerals for dead animals in Indiana was about to orchestrate the largest mass death of American civilians until September 11, 2001. The heat was the first thing they noticed. Stepping off the plane in Georgetown, Guyana, in 1977, the American followers of Jim Jones felt the tropical air wrap around them like a wet blanket, thick and suffocating. But many of them smiled despite the sweat already beading on their foreheads. They had been promised paradise, a socialist utopia carved from the jungle. And after the years of scrutiny and persecution they believed they had endured in the United States, this South American nation seemed like deliverance itself. Jones had painted Jonestown in colors so vivid, so impossibly bright, that his followers could almost see it before they arrived. He called it the Promised Land, a place where racism would dissolve in the common purpose of collective labor, where capitalism's cruel hierarchies would be replaced by true equality, where black and white would work side by side in harmony. In the temple back in San Francisco, and later in Los Angeles, he had described verdant fields and abundant harvests, children laughing as they played in clear streams, community buildings where they would gather for entertainment and education. He spoke of freedom from American oppression, from FBI surveillance, from the racist structure of a society that would never accept their integrated socialist vision. Guyana would be different. Guyana would be theirs. The early settlers who arrived in 1976 and early 1977 often wrote letters home that seemed to confirm Jones' promises. These letters, which former members later revealed were carefully monitored and edited, described purposeful days filled with meaningful work, evenings of music and laughter, and a profound sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. One woman wrote to her sister in California, describing how beautiful the jungle canopy looked at dawn, how the scarlet macaws flew overhead like living flame. A man wrote about the satisfying exhaustion of building something permanent, something that would last. These testimonies, read aloud at temple meetings back in the States, fueled the exodus that would eventually bring more than 900 Americans to the Guyanese interior. Laura Johnston Cole was among those early arrivals, and she remembers the genuine hope that animated those first months. The work was hard, she would later testify, but it felt redemptive. They were clearing jungle, digging foundations, planting crops. They were creating from nothing. The community spirit in those early days was real, she insisted. People believed they were part of a grand experiment in human possibility, pioneers in a movement that could eventually transform the world. They sang as they worked. They truly believed they were building utopia. But the reality of Jonestown began to reveal itself slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution, the dark parts emerging gradually until the whole image became clear. The settlement sat in a remote corner of northwestern Guyana, hours from the nearest town by the only road, itself barely passable in the rainy season. The jungle surrounded the compound on all sides, a wall of green that seemed beautiful from a distance, but up close was chaotic and hostile, filled with insects, snakes, and the constant threat of infection from the smallest cut. The cleared land where the settlement stood was small, perhaps 50 acres that had been wrestled from the forest at enormous cost in human labor. The workday began at 6:30 in the morning and did not end until 6 in the evening, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Adults swung machetes in the fields, hauled timber, dug ditches for drainage and irrigation, constructed buildings from raw lumber. Children as young as 6 were expected to contribute, weeding gardens, caring for animals, helping in the kitchen. The heat was relentless, the humidity so thick it felt like breathing underwater. Workers collapsed regularly from exhaustion and dehydration. Medical care was primitive. A small staff of nurses did their best, but supplies were limited and serious cases had to be taken to the Guyanese capital, a journey that could take a full day. And then there was the food. In San Francisco, the People's Temple had operated a communal kitchen that served hot meals to the homeless and elderly, meals that were nourishing and plentiful. In Jonestown, everyone ate the same thing nearly every day: rice with thin gravy, occasionally supplemented with vegetables from the gardens, or, on rare occasions, small portions of meat. The portions were small. People lost weight rapidly in the tropical heat, burning calories faster than they could consume them. Former members report a constant gnawing hunger that became so familiar it was almost like another presence in the settlement. Meanwhile, Jones himself maintained a separate house where he ate chicken, pork, and fresh fruit. This inequality, so blatant and so at odds with the socialist principles he preached, went unquestioned in public, though people whispered about it late at night in their crowded bunkhouses. The buildings themselves told a story of deteriorating dreams. What Jones had promised as comfortable cottages turned out to be rough wooden structures raised on stilts, with walls that did not quite meet the ceiling, allowing insects free passage. Dozens of people slept in each building on thin mattresses, so close together that if one person turned over, everyone in the row felt it. Privacy did not exist. Personal possessions were minimal, sometimes stored in a single box or bag beneath the bed. The settlement had electricity for only a few hours each evening, generated by a struggling diesel system. When darkness fell, the compound was lit by kerosene lamps that cast long shadows and filled the air with smoke. But the worst intrusion was the noise. Loudspeakers had been installed throughout the compound, mounted on poles and attached to buildings, and through these speakers Jones broadcast his voice at all hours. He would preach his rambling sermons deep into the night, his words slurred and paranoid, ranting about enemies and conspiracies and the need for absolute loyalty. He talked about revolutionary suicide, about the beauty of dying for a cause rather than surrendering to oppression. He invoked the deaths of those who had resisted fascism, compared the People's Temple to freedom fighters throughout history. People lay in their beds, exhausted from 12 hours of labor, unable to sleep as Jones' voice poured into their ears hour after hour. Even when he was not speaking, he played music, news broadcasts from the Soviet Union, recordings of other speeches. The loudspeakers were never silent for long. Those who tried to leave discovered that escape was not a simple matter of packing a bag and walking away. Upon arrival in Jonestown, members had been required to surrender their passports to the settlement's administrative office for safekeeping. These documents were locked away, inaccessible to the people who owned them. Armed guards, members of Jones' inner circle who carried rifles and machetes, patrolled the perimeter of the compound. They were ostensibly there to protect the settlement from outside threats, but their presence also served another purpose. Anyone attempting to leave without permission would be stopped, questioned, brought before Jones himself to explain their disloyalty. The jungle itself was a prison more effective than any walls. Beyond the cleared land lay miles of dense forest with no marked trails, no roads, no safe passage. Poisonous snakes moved through the undergrowth. Jaguars hunted in the darkness. The rivers contained caimans and piranhas. Even experienced guides could become lost in that maze of vegetation where every direction looked the same. And if someone did manage to navigate the jungle to the nearest town, they would find themselves in a foreign country without documents, without money, speaking only English, in a place where the official language was English, but many spoke only Creole or indigenous languages. They would be dependent on the goodwill of strangers, and Jones had cultivated relationships with local officials who might not be sympathetic to defectors from the settlement. It was in this atmosphere of isolation and control that Jones introduced what he called White Nights. These events began sometime in 1977, though the exact date is difficult to establish from survivor accounts. The alarm would sound late at night, a blaring siren that jolted people from sleep. Everyone was required to report immediately to the Central Pavilion, the open-air structure at the heart of the settlement where meetings were held and meals were served. Stumbling through the darkness, people would gather in the pavilion to find Jones waiting, his voice urgent, warning of imminent attack. The enemies changed depending on the night. Sometimes it was CIA operatives who had surrounded the compound and would soon open fire. Sometimes it was Guyanese soldiers coming to destroy the settlement and arrest them all. Sometimes it was mercenaries hired by family members who wanted to kidnap their relatives back to the United States. The threat was always immediate, always deadly, and Jones always presented the same solution. Rather than be taken alive, rather than be tortured or imprisoned or forced to watch their children suffer, they would choose to die on their own terms. Revolutionary suicide, he called it. A final act of defiance. Vats of liquid would be brought out, usually a flavored drink mix prepared in large quantities. Jones would announce that the drink contained poison, that within minutes of consuming it they would die peacefully, together, united in purpose even in death. People were ordered to line up, to take a cup, to drink. And they did. Mothers gave the drink to their children first, tilting the cups to small lips. The elderly drank without hesitation. Young men and women drank and then stood waiting for the poison to take effect. Minutes would pass. 5 death die. 10 that went. 15. People would look at each other with growing confusion. No one collapsed. No one showed signs of distress. and then Jones would laugh, or one of his lieutenants would announce that this had been a test, a loyalty drill to see who truly had the faith to follow through. The relief was profound and immediate, people embracing and crying, grateful to be alive. But the experience left its mark. They had been willing. They had drunk what they believed was poison. They had crossed a psychological threshold that would be impossible to uncross. The white nights became more frequent as 1978 progressed. Once a month became once a week, then sometimes twice in a single week. Each time, the ritual was the same. The alarm, the gathering, the announcement of enemies, the order to drink. Each time, people complied with less hesitation. They were being trained, though most did not recognize it. They were being conditioned to respond to Jones' command, even when that command meant death. They were rehearsing. Some survivors have described a strange comfort that developed around these drills. The fear remained, but it became familiar. They knew they would wake up the next morning. They knew it was theater. And yet, the knowledge that they could do it, that they could look death in the face and accept it for the sake of the community, created a perverse sense of pride. Jones praised them after each white night, told them they were the bravest people on earth, the most committed revolutionaries. He told them that when the real moment came, if it came, they would be ready. Not everyone accepted this logic. Some people began to question, quietly at first, why they needed to practice dying, why the emphasis on death rather than survival, why Jones seemed almost eager for the confrontation he claimed to fear. But raising these questions openly was dangerous. Jones had created a system of informants within the community, people who reported private conversations, doubts expressed in whispered exchanges. Those identified as doubters were subjected to public humiliation in meetings that could last hours, forced to stand before the entire community, while Jones and others shouted accusations and demanded confessions. Some were assigned extra labor shifts or reduced food ration. A few were physically punished, beaten, or placed in a plywood box barely large enough to contain a human body, left there for hours in the tropical heat. The drills continued through the summer and fall of 1978. By then, Jonestown had become something that bore no resemblance to the utopia Jones had promised. It was a labor camp ruled by fear and exhaustion, where hungry people worked themselves to collapse under the watch of armed guards, where sleep was interrupted by propaganda and loyalty tests, where the threat of death had become so routine it was almost boring. And yet, most people stayed. Some stayed because they had no way to leave. Others stayed because they still believed, despite everything, that the cause was just even if the methods were harsh. Many stayed because everyone they loved was there, and they could not imagine abandoning their families. They had no way of knowing that the rehearsals would soon become real, that the poison Jones had pretended to give them would be prepared in earnest, that the loyalty he had demanded in drill after drill would be called upon one final time. They could not imagine that the white nights were not just tests but training, preparing them for an act so horrific that without this conditioning, it would have been unthinkable. In the jungle heat, exhausted and hungry and afraid, they waited for whatever would come next. The letters arrived at Congressman Leo Ryan's San Francisco office throughout the autumn of 1978, each one more desperate than the last. Worried parents, frantic siblings, and estranged spouses wrote about family members who had vanished into the jungles of Guyana with People's Temple. Some letters described relatives who had stopped writing home. Others shared cryptic messages that seemed to contain coded pleas for help. A few writers believed their loved ones were being held against their will, trapped in a settlement called Jonestown that Jim Jones had built deep in the South American wilderness. Ryan, a Democrat who represented the district where People's Temple had maintained its San Francisco headquarters, felt a growing sense of responsibility. These were his constituents, and their anguish was genuine. He began to wonder what was really happening in that remote jungle commune. By mid-November, Ryan had made a decision that would cost him his life. He would lead a fact-finding mission to Jonestown, observe conditions firsthand, and give any members who wished to leave the opportunity to return home with him. It was an unprecedented move. No sitting member of Congress had ever visited Jonestown, and Jim Jones had worked hard to keep it that way. The congressman assembled a delegation that included congressional aides, concerned relatives of temple members, and critically, a news crew from NBC. Reporter Don Harris and cameraman Bob Brown would document everything. The presence of journalists was intentional. Ryan understood that sunlight was the best disinfectant, and whatever was happening in Jonestown needed to be brought into the open. The delegation's journey to Jonestown was fraught with obstacles from the beginning. Jones initially refused to allow the group entry, claiming they were enemies of the church. After tense negotiations, he relented but insisted that the journalists could not accompany the congressman. Ryan refused to back down. If NBC couldn't film, he wouldn't visit. Jones eventually agreed, but the battle of wills had already begun. The message was clear. Jones controlled Jonestown, and visitors entered on his terms. On November 17, 1978, Ryan's group finally reached Jonestown. What they found was surreal, a bizarre performance staged specifically for their benefit. As the visitors emerged from the truck that had brought them from the Port Kaituma airstrip, they were greeted by a spectacle that seemed designed to overwhelm their senses. The entire community, more than 900 people, had assembled to welcome them. A band played enthusiastic music. Smiling residents clapped and swayed. Children danced with seemingly spontaneous joy. Jones himself, wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy jungle sky, played the role of benevolent leader, spreading his arms wide in greeting. The message of this elaborate welcome was unmistakable. Jonestown was a paradise, and its residents were happy, productive people building a new world. But those who looked closely could see cracks in the facade. Some of the smiling faces seemed strained, almost desperate. The enthusiasm felt forced, mechanical. Don Harris, the NBC reporter, had covered enough stories to recognize when someone was putting on a show. His camera captured the welcome ceremony, preserving the strange disconnect between the celebratory atmosphere and the underlying tension that hung in the humid air. Bob Brown's footage would later reveal details that weren't immediately obvious. The armed guards stationed at the periphery, the watchful eyes of Jones's inner circle, tracking every visitor's movement, the way certain residents seemed to shrink back when they thought no one was looking. Ryan and his group spent the evening touring the settlement. Jones led them through the medical clinic, the school, the fields where residents grew cassava and vegetables. Everything appeared orderly, even impressive. Here was proof, Jones seemed to say, that his socialist vision could work. But the tour was carefully choreographed. Certain areas remained off limits. Questions about work schedules, food rations, and freedom of movement received vague, deflecting answers. When relatives in the visiting group tried to speak privately with temple members, Jones's lieutenants intervened, always with a smile, always with a plausible reason why now wasn't a good time. That night, the delegation attended a cultural performance in the pavilion, an open-sided structure that served as Jonestown's central gathering place. The show was elaborate, featuring music, dancing, and testimonials from residents praising their life in the jungle. Jones sat on his throne-like chair, occasionally making comments into his microphone, reminding everyone of his presence. The visitors sat on benches, clapping politely, trying to process what they were seeing. The event stretched for hours, a marathon of manufactured joy that felt increasingly oppressive as the night wore on. Then came the moment that changed everything. As the performance continued, several People's Temple members began to move through the crowd with apparent casualness. To the untrained eye, they seemed to be mingling, greeting the visitors. But some of them had another purpose. A woman approached NBC reporter Don Harris, and while pretending to shake his hand, pressed a folded piece of paper into his palm. The note was brief, but devastating. It listed names of people who wanted to leave Jonestown, but were afraid to speak openly. Another note was passed to one of the concerned relatives. Then another. Each small piece of paper represented an enormous act of courage. These people were risking everything to ask for help. The notes presented Ryan with an impossible situation. If he confronted Jones directly, he might provoke a crisis. If he ignored the pleas, he would be abandoning people who had specifically asked for rescue. The tension in the pavilion became almost unbearable. Jones continued his performance, seemingly unaware of the secret messages being passed, but some of his aides had noticed. Their expressions hardened. The atmosphere shifted from staged hospitality to barely concealed hostility. The following morning, November 18th, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Word had spread that some residents wanted to leave with Ryan's group. Jones called an emergency meeting in the pavilion. His mood had darkened. The benevolent leader persona had cracked, revealing the paranoid authoritarian beneath. He spoke of traitors and enemies, of those who would betray the community. But he also made a calculated decision. He announced that anyone who truly wanted to leave was free to go. It was a test, a way to identify the unfaithful. Over the next few tense hours, 14 people stepped forward to join Ryan's delegation. The defectors gathered their meager belongings, avoiding eye contact with those who remained. Some families were being torn apart. Parents left without children. Siblings were divided. The emotional toll was devastating. As preparations for departure began, violence erupted. A man named Don Sly, a temple member, attempted to stab Ryan with a knife. The attack was stopped, but the message was clear: leaving Jonestown would not be simple. Jones made a show of apologizing, blaming the incident on the emotional stress of the moment. But his eyes were cold, calculating. Ryan, shaken but determined, decided they needed to leave immediately. The group was too large for a single plane, so 2 aircraft were arranged to meet them at the Port Kaituma airstrip, several miles away. The journey to the airstrip should have taken 30 minutes. For the defectors, it must have felt like an eternity. They climbed into the truck that would take them away from Jonestown, away from years of control and manipulation. Some wept with relief. Others sat in stunned silence. Among them was Larry Layton, a longtime temple member who claimed he wanted to defect. Several of the genuine defectors were uneasy about Layton. He was too close to Jones, too embedded in the power structure. But Ryan's group was focused on getting everyone out safely. Layton was allowed to board. At Port Kaituma airstrip, chaos and hope mingled in the tropical afternoon. The 2 planes, a larger Twin Otter and a smaller Cessna, waited on the dirt runway. Bob Brown, the NBC cameraman, continued filming. Don Harris conducted last-minute interviews. Ryan helped load people onto the planes. The mood was tense but cautiously optimistic. They had done it. They were getting people out. Then someone spotted a tractor trailer approaching in the distance, moving fast along the dirt road that led from Jonestown. The vehicle was loud, its engine straining. As it drew closer, those at the airstrip could see people riding in the trailer bed. Temple members. And they were armed. What happened next unfolded with terrible speed. The tractor trailer skidded to a stop near the planes. Armed men jumped down and immediately opened fire. At the same moment, inside the smaller Cessna, Larry Layton pulled out a gun and began shooting at the people packed into the aircraft. The ambush was coordinated, planned, ruthless. Bob Brown, the cameraman, kept filming even as the gunfire erupted. His footage captured the initial moments of the attack, the confusion, the terror. Then his camera recorded his own murder. The film shows armed men approaching, raising their weapons, and then the image goes dark. Brown was shot at point-blank range, still holding his camera. Don Harris, the NBC reporter who had uncovered the secret notes, was also killed in the first volley of gunfire. Richard Dwyer, a U.S. Embassy official, was wounded but survived. Congressman Leo Ryan, the man who had come to rescue those who asked for help, was shot repeatedly. He died on that dirt airstrip, the first and only U.S. congressman to be assassinated in the line of duty. The gunmen were methodical. They moved among the wounded, firing additional shots to ensure their targets were dead. Patricia Parks, a defector who had escaped Jonestown only an hour before, was murdered. NBC photographer Greg Robinson was executed. Several others were critically wounded. The shooting lasted several minutes, though for those huddled behind the airplane wheels or lying wounded on the ground, it must have seemed endless. Inside the Cessna, Larry Layton's attack had been less successful. His gun jammed after the first shots, and the passengers, despite being wounded and terrified, managed to restrain him. The pilot, who had been hit, still managed to keep the aircraft grounded. Had the plane taken off with Layton shooting inside the cabin, everyone aboard would likely have died. When the shooting finally stopped, the temple gunmen returned to their tractor trailer and drove back toward Jonestown. They left behind 5 bodies and numerous wounded survivors lying on the airstrip. The tropical sun beat down, blood mixed with the red dirt of the runway. The small group of survivors, some seriously injured, faced a new nightmare. They were miles from help, surrounded by jungle, and they knew that Jim Jones was capable of anything. As darkness began to fall on Port Kaituma airstrip, those who survived the ambush had no way of knowing that the worst was yet to come. Back at Jonestown, Jim Jones was preparing for his final act, one that would transform this remote jungle settlement from a crime scene into a mass grave. The jungle sounds of Guyana, on November 18, 1978, were no different than any other evening. Birds called to each other as dusk approached, insects hummed in the heavy tropical air, and the dense canopy of trees swayed gently in the breeze. But in a remote agricultural settlement carved from the wilderness, something unthinkable was beginning to unfold. At approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Jim Jones ordered a sound engineer to turn on the recording equipment. For the next 44 minutes, a tape would roll, capturing what would become known as the death tape, the most chilling audio document of mass murder in modern history. The tape begins with Jones's voice, already agitated, already weaving the narrative he would use to convince over 900 people that their lives must end. His words come in rambling torrents, paranoid justifications mixing with revolutionary rhetoric. He speaks of enemies closing in, of government forces that will torture them, of a world that will never let them live in peace. He calls it revolutionary suicide, a phrase that transforms murder into political action, death into defiance. In his distorted worldview, this mass killing represents the ultimate act of resistance against oppression. But listening to the tape reveals something far darker than protest. It reveals manipulation at its most lethal. Jones's voice dominates the recording, but other sounds pierce through his monologue. The pavilion where this final gathering took place was the community's central meeting area, a large open-sided structure with a roof but no walls. Around 900 people crowded into that space and the surrounding area, called there by orders that no one could refuse. The armed guards who had always been present at Jonestown meetings now took on a new purpose. They positioned themselves at the edges of the crowd, rifles visible, watching for anyone who might try to flee. In the background of the tape, you can hear the mundane sounds of a community gathering. People shifting position, murmuring conversations, the scrape of benches being moved. Then other sounds begin to emerge. Medical personnel had set up a table with a large metal tub. Inside that tub, nurses mixed a deadly concoction. They combined cyanide with a grape-flavored drink powder, often mistakenly reported as Kool-Aid but actually Flavor Aid, a cheaper alternative that Jones preferred for his impoverished settlement. The poison created a dark purple liquid that would burn going down, causing immediate agony before death. Jones had rehearsed this moment before. Survivors later testified about white nights, emergency gatherings in the middle of the night where Jones would claim enemies were attacking, and everyone had to drink from cups that might contain poison. These were loyalty tests, psychological conditioning that prepared people for the unthinkable. But on this evening, there would be no morning revelation that it was just a drill. This time, the poison was real. Then comes the moment on the tape that stands as a testament to human courage in the face of overwhelming pressure. A woman's voice rises above the crowd, clear and firm. Christine Miller was a 60-year-old African-American woman who had been part of People's Temple for years. Unlike many members who had been broken down by Jones's manipulation, Christine retained her ability to think critically and speak her mind. Her voice on the tape is remarkable for its clarity and reason. She questions Jones directly. She asks why they cannot go to Russia, a country Jones had often mentioned as a possible refuge. She suggests that dying is not the only option, that alternatives exist. Her words are measured but firm, the voice of someone refusing to accept a false choice between mass death and imagined torture. For several minutes, Christine Miller engages Jones in a debate that he clearly did not expect and does not welcome. Other voices on the tape support Jones, shouting her down, but Christine persists. She represents the resistance that might have been, the voice of sanity in a moment of collective madness. Jones dismisses her concerns with a combination of manipulation and veiled threat. He claims to love her as much as anyone but insists she does not understand the reality they face. He points to a non-existent threat, to government forces he claims are coming to destroy them. He accuses her of lacking faith in the cause. His tone shifts between fatherly condescension and barely concealed anger. Eventually, Christine's voice fades from the tape. She would die along with everyone else, her brave objections overruled by a man who had convinced hundreds that he spoke with divine authority. Then the murders begin. Jones orders that the children be brought forward first. This decision was strategic and devastating. By killing the children first, Jones eliminated any reason for parents to resist. Once your child is dead, what reason do you have to live? This psychological trap snapped shut on hundreds of parents who watched their babies die. The sounds on the tape from this point forward are nearly unbearable to hear. Babies scream, high-pitched wails of pain and terror that cut through everything else on the recording. The cyanide burned their mouths and throats. Their tiny bodies convulsed. Nurses used syringes without needles, squirting the poison directly into the infants' mouths, forcing them to swallow the liquid that would kill them within minutes. Mothers and fathers were made to watch, some holding their children as they died, others standing paralyzed by shock and horror. Medical staff moved through the crowd with a terrible efficiency. They had prepared for this moment, whether knowingly or not. For the elderly or infirm who could not drink the poison themselves, nurses used syringes to inject it directly. These injection marks would later be found on many bodies, evidence that not everyone died willingly. The mechanics of mass murder require organization, and Jonestown had been organized around Jones's will for years. That infrastructure of obedience now became an infrastructure of death. Throughout this nightmare, voices on the tape can be heard applauding Jones. Members of his inner circle, true believers who had surrendered their judgment entirely, actually clap and cheer as their leader describes the beauty of dying together. They call out words of support, affirming his decision, encouraging others to see this as a victorious moment rather than a tragedy. This collective affirmation created a social pressure that made resistance even harder. To refuse the poison was to stand against not just Jones, but against the community itself, against friends and family who had already accepted their fate. But some did resist. Some refused to die. Survivors who later testified described slipping away during the chaos, moving quietly toward the edges of the pavilion while attention focused on the mass of people drinking poison and dying. One survivor described crawling under the floorboards of a building adjacent to the pavilion, hiding in the narrow space while listening to the screams and groans of people dying above. Another recalled running into the jungle, expecting gunfire to cut him down at any moment, but somehow making it into the dense vegetation that surrounded the settlement. Those who hid in the jungle described hearing the sounds carry through the trees. The screaming gradually diminished as more people died. Jones's voice continued on the loudspeaker system, still talking, still justifying, still controlling even as his followers convulsed and died around him. Survivors spoke of the eerie quality of that evening, the way the normal jungle sounds seemed to stop, as if nature itself recoiled from what was happening. The tape runs for 44 minutes, but the dying continued long after the recording ended. Some people took longer to die than others. The cyanide dosage varied, and individual body chemistry affected how quickly the poison worked. People collapsed where they stood or sat. They fell on top of each other, parents clutching children, families dying in embraces. The pavilion became a mass of bodies, a scene that would horrify the first outsiders to arrive days later. Armed guards ensured compliance throughout. Several survivors reported that guards shot people who tried to flee. The final body count would reveal that while most died from cyanide poisoning, many others had injection marks suggesting forced poisoning, and some had gunshot wounds. These physical facts contradict the narrative Jones tried to create on the tape, his insistence that this was a voluntary act of revolutionary defiance. The evidence on the bodies told a different story. This was murder, coerced and enforced. Jones himself died from a gunshot wound to the head. Whether self-inflicted or delivered by an aide remains uncertain, but his body was found with a bullet wound that killed him instantly. He escaped the suffering he inflicted on others, the burning pain of cyanide, the convulsions and the terror. His final words on the tape encourage people to die with dignity, to see this as a great moment. But there is no dignity in forcing poison down a baby's throat. There is no glory in armed guards shooting people who try to escape. The final count reached 909 dead. More than 300 of them were children, murdered by the adults who were supposed to protect them. The bodies lay in the tropical heat for days before military personnel could reach the remote site, and begin the grim work of identification and removal. The scene exceeded anything rescuers had encountered. Bodies had begun to decompose rapidly in the heat. Families lay intertwined, making separation difficult. The pavilion area was carpeted with the dead. The death tape exists as evidence and as warning. It captures the voice of a charismatic leader who convinced people to murder their children and themselves. It preserves Christine Miller's brave resistance and the community's tragic rejection of her reason. It contains the screams of dying babies and the applause of true believers. For 44 minutes, it documents the mechanics of how mass murder unfolds when authority goes unquestioned and critical thinking is surrendered. Listening to that tape forces confrontation with uncomfortable questions about human nature and social dynamics. How does a community reach the point where parents will poison their children? What combination of isolation, indoctrination, and fear makes the unthinkable become reality? The answers lie in years of psychological manipulation, in the gradual erosion of individual judgment, in the replacement of family bonds with organizational loyalty, and ultimately in the presence of armed force, backing up a leader's commands. The death tape stands as one of the most disturbing historical documents ever recorded, a real-time audio chronicle of mass murder that reveals the terrible power of manipulation and the tragic consequences of surrendered autonomy. The Guyanese Defense Force patrol appeared at the edge of Jonestown just after dawn, on November 19, 1978. They had been dispatched to investigate reports of trouble at the remote agricultural commune, though nothing in their briefing prepared them for what waited in the clearing ahead. The jungle morning was already thick with heat, and as the soldiers stepped from the tree line into the open pavilion area, they encountered a smell so overwhelming that several of them immediately turned away to vomit in the underbrush. The initial sight seemed almost incomprehensible to the human mind attempting to process it. Bodies were everywhere, spread across the central pavilion grounds in arrangements that suggested both organization and chaos. Hundreds of people lay in concentric circles, radiating outward from the main stage, as if they had gathered for some final ceremony and simply never risen. The colors were what struck the first responders most violently. The bright tropical clothing, the vivid reds and yellows and blues, created a grotesque contrast against the pallor of death. Children's toys lay scattered among the corpses. A doll with blonde hair, a red rubber ball, a small stuffed bear that had fallen from lifeless fingers. The Guyanese soldiers moved slowly through the scene, their boots careful not to disturb what they instinctively understood was evidence of something monstrous. Their commander began making notes, attempting to count the dead, but the numbers seemed impossible. He radioed back to Georgetown with an initial estimate of 408 bodies. It was an unfathomable number, but he counted again, walking the perimeter, marking groups on his notepad. 408 American citizens, dead in the jungle of a foreign country. The Guyanese government immediately understood they were dealing with something beyond their resources and capacity. What the soldiers did not yet realize, what would only become clear in the horrifying days to come, was that their count was catastrophically low. The bodies they could see represented only the surface of the tragedy. Beneath the first layer of dead lay another layer, and then another. Families had died in embraces so complete that from above they appeared as single form. Parents had wrapped their arms around their children in final acts of protection or restraint, creating human cocoons that hid the smallest victims from initial view. U.S. Air Force teams arrived within 48 hours, part of a joint task force that included the Army's graves registration units and mortuary specialists. These men and women had served in Vietnam, had processed casualties from helicopter crashes and combat operations, had seen death in forms both sudden and prolonged. Yet veteran service members would later state, in official reports and unofficial conversations, that nothing in their military experience compared to Jonestown. The team suited up in full hazmat gear, the thick rubber suits trapping equatorial heat against their bodies until their own sweat became a secondary enemy. The temperature in the Guyanese interior hovered around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity approaching 100%. In such conditions, the tropical environment accelerates decomposition with merciless efficiency. Bodies bloat rapidly as internal bacteria proliferate, gases expand, skin slips from underlying tissue. The American personnel worked in 30-minute rotations, emerging from the pavilion area physically and psychologically depleted, only to return after brief respites to continue the grim accounting. As the recovery teams began the systematic work of separating and documenting the dead, the true scale of the massacre revealed itself. When workers lifted the first layer of bodies, they found children underneath. Dozens of children. Then dozens more. Infants still in their mothers' arms. Toddlers pressed beneath parents who had perhaps fallen on them deliberately, trying to shield them from witnessing the final moments, or perhaps collapsing upon them as the poison took effect. The body count began to climb with sickening speed. 408 became 500. 500 became 650. 700. 800. The final count reached 918 human beings. 918 American citizens, dead by poison in a single afternoon. The mathematical revision was almost as disturbing as the deaths themselves. How had trained military observers missed more than 500 bodies in their initial assessment? The answer lay in the cruel intimacy of how people died. They had clutched each other so completely, layered themselves so thoroughly in family units, that from any distance or angle they appeared as perhaps a third of their actual number. Each body required documentation. Photographs from multiple angles, physical descriptions, noting clothing, jewelry, distinguishing marks. The collection of personal effects, carefully bagged and labeled. Wedding rings. Watches stopped at the approximate time of death. Identification cards that many still carried in pockets. The Air Force mortuary teams worked with methodical precision, understanding that every corpse represented someone's child, someone's parent, someone's spouse. Somewhere back in the United States, people were waiting for phone calls that would shatter their worlds. The work was not merely physically demanding, but spiritually corrosive. Servicemen and women, trained to handle remains with dignity, found themselves navigating an ethical maze with no clear paths. How do you honor the dead when there are nearly 1,000 of them? When the heat is destroying evidence by the hour? When the sheer logistics threaten to overwhelm reverence? Personnel reported nightmares that persisted for decades. The sounds of body bags being zipped. The sight of cargo planes being loaded with aluminum transfer cases stacked like cordwood. The knowledge that inside those cases were children, hundreds of children, who never had a choice in their own deaths. Survivor accounts added layers of horror to the physical evidence. A handful of people had managed to escape into the jungle during the final white night, that last loyalty test that turned into mass murder. They had hidden in the dense undergrowth, hearing the loudspeakers carrying Jones's voice across the compound, the sounds of crying that gradually diminished into terrible silence. Some survivors stayed hidden for days, terrified that armed guards might still patrol the perimeter. When they finally crept back to Jonestown, they found a necropolis. One young man had fled into the forest with his brother during the confusion. They spent the night huddled beneath a fallen log, listening to sounds they could not identify drifting through the darkness. When they returned the following afternoon, walking slowly toward the pavilion with dread building in their chests, they found their mother lying near the central stage, their two younger sisters curled against her sides. The family they had eaten breakfast with just days before was simply gone, transformed into evidence in a criminal investigation. Another survivor, a woman who had hidden near the perimeter with her infant daughter, described returning to find the entire community she had known for years, the friends she had made, the elderly members she had cared for, all dead within an area smaller than a football field. She walked among people she recognized, their faces already distorted by decomposition in the tropical heat, and understood that she was now the keeper of their stories, the living memory of the dead. On the main pavilion stage, recovery teams found James Warren Jones dead. While he had commanded his followers to drink the poison, while he had ordered mothers to squirt the cyanide mixture into their babies' mouths using syringes, while he had instructed his nurses to ensure that everyone consumed the lethal dose, Jones had chosen a different end for himself. His body lay near his chair, a single gunshot wound to his right temple. The bullet had entered behind his right ear and exited through his left temple, the trajectory suggesting either self-infliction or a shot fired by someone standing very close. The discovery of Jones's body and the manner of his death revealed a final hypocrisy that survivors and investigators found particularly disturbing. The man who had preached about revolutionary suicide who had framed the mass death as a beautiful act of defiance against fascism and persecution, had apparently found poison insufficient for his own exit. He had forced over 900 people to die in agony, cyanide burning through their systems over minutes that must have felt like hours, while he chose the relative instantaneousness of a bullet. Forensic analysts noted that Jones's body showed other signs of distress. His arms bore injection marks suggesting he had consumed or been given drugs, possibly sedatives, before his death. Some investigators theorized he had been partially incapacitated, perhaps by his own hand, to make the final act easier. Others suggested that someone close to him, perhaps one of his inner circle, had fired the shot at his request. The exact circumstances remained ambiguous, but the central fact stood undeniable. Jones had exempted himself from the death he demanded of everyone else. The U.S. Air Force mortuary teams worked for days under conditions that tested the limits of human endurance and psychological resilience. They established assembly lines of death, stations where bodies were photographed, documented, searched for identification, and prepared for transport. The Guyanese government provided a nearby airstrip where cargo planes waited to receive the dead. The military personnel developed dark coping mechanisms, gallows humor that helped them process the unprocessable, rituals that created psychological distance from the work their hands performed. Back in the United States, families waited for news. The initial reports were confusing, contradictory. How many dead? Who survived? The State Department established crisis centers to field desperate calls from relatives who had not heard from loved ones in Jonestown. As the body count climbed and climbed, hope drained away like water through cupped fingers. The realization settled across America that this was not a tragedy with survivors, but an extinction event. An entire community had been erased in a single afternoon. The photographs taken by military personnel and journalists who arrived in the following days remain among the most disturbing images in American history. Wide shots showing the sheer scale of death, the pavilion area carpeted with bodies in their bright clothing. Close shots revealing the intimate horrors, the children still embraced by parents, the families clustered together. The images are rarely published in their full unedited form, considered too graphic for public consumption, yet they exist in archives as testimony to what happened when charismatic authority met absolute power and unquestioning fate. Jonestown was eventually abandoned to the jungle. The buildings fell into decay, reclaimed by vines and weather. But the memory of what the Guyanese soldiers found that November morning, what the American recovery teams processed in their hazmat suits under the merciless tropical sun, remains vivid in the minds of those who witnessed it and in the historical record of human capacity for both devotion and destruction. The sun rose over Jonestown on November 19, 1978, revealing a scene that defied comprehension. But in the decades since that horrific day, the questions have only multiplied, growing more complex with each newly declassified document, each survivor's testimony, each sealed file that the FBI refuses to release even now. The official narrative tells us this was mass suicide, a congregation so devoted they willingly drank poisoned flavor aid at their leader's command. The so-called death tape seems to support this conclusion. You can hear voices on that recording, voices of people who sound eerily calm, almost resigned. Some appear to accept their fate. But listen closer to that tape, past the speeches and the strange measured tones. You'll hear something else. You'll hear children screaming. You'll hear people questioning, resisting. You'll hear Christine Miller, a brave woman who stood up to Jim Jones in those final moments, arguing that there were alternatives, that they didn't have to do this. Her voice was silenced, but it remains preserved on that recording, evidence that not everyone went willingly into the dark. Recently released FBI files paint a far more disturbing picture. Medical examiners found injection marks on bodies, puncture wounds on people who supposedly drank the poison voluntarily. Syringes were discovered scattered among the dead. The cyanide was found not just in cups, but in the bodies of children, of infants who could not possibly have chosen to die. Dr. Leslie Mutu, the chief medical examiner who arrived at the scene, estimated that as many as 700 of the 909 victims showed signs of forcible injection. 700 people who may have been murdered, not suicides, but homicide victims. Then there are the survivors who weren't there, the ones who escaped death by pure chance or divine intervention, depending on what you believe. The Jonestown basketball team was in Georgetown that day, young men playing a tournament game while their families died. These survivors have given conflicting accounts over the years, their stories shifting and changing. Some say they knew something terrible was coming. Others insist they had no idea Jones had reached this level of madness. A few have suggested they were deliberately sent away, that Jones wanted some people to survive to tell his story, though which story he wanted told remains unclear. The conspiracy theories have never gone away. In fact, they've grown stronger as more information emerges. Jim Jones was an avowed socialist who had connections to left-wing political movements across the Americas. He claimed to be building a socialist paradise in the jungle. Some researchers point to suspicious individuals who appeared at the compound in the months before the massacre, people who didn't fit the typical profile of Jones's followers. Who were these men? What were they doing there? The CIA involvement theory persists for several reasons. Jones's political ideology made him a person of interest during the Cold War. The compound was located near sensitive territory in Guyana, close to areas where American intelligence agencies had operations. Witnesses reported seeing unusual equipment at Jonestown, communications technology that seemed beyond what a simple agricultural project would need. And perhaps most tellingly, when Congressman Leo Ryan arrived to investigate Jonestown, he was murdered on an airstrip along with 4 others. Who gave the order to kill a United States congressman? Was it simply Jim Jones, or was something larger at play? Some former intelligence officials have suggested that Jonestown may have been a mind control experiment gone catastrophically wrong. The conditions there, the isolation, the sleep deprivation, the constant broadcasts of Jones's voice, the punishment and reward systems, all mirror techniques that were being explored by intelligence agencies in programs like MK Ultra. Could Jonestown have been a laboratory for studying human behavior under extreme conditions? The government has never confirmed this, but they've never fully denied it either. What troubles investigators most is the physical evidence that doesn't add up. How could 909 people die so quickly and so quietly? Guards were posted around the compound that day, armed men who prevented people from fleeing. Survivors report hearing shots fired at those who tried to run into the jungle. This doesn't sound like voluntary suicide. This sounds like execution. The question that haunts every serious examination of Jonestown is the one with no clear answer. At what point did faith become fatal entroplement? When did following a charismatic leader transform from seeking spiritual meaning into surrendering the will to live? The people who went to Jonestown weren't all naive or foolish. Many were educated, thoughtful individuals seeking a better world. They believed in racial equality, in communal living, in helping the poor. These were ideals worth pursuing. But somewhere in the jungle, those ideals became twisted into something unrecognizable. Former members describe a gradual process, like a frog being slowly boiled. Each small demand led to a larger one. Each loyalty test was followed by a more extreme requirement. By the time people realized they were trapped, escape seemed impossible. Jones held their passports, controlled all communication with the outside world, and had armed guards patrolling the perimeter. But the deepest prison wasn't physical. It was psychological. He convinced them that the outside world wanted to destroy them, that leaving meant betrayal, that death might be preferable to life without the community. And yet, some of those FBI files remain sealed to this day. More than 45 years after the massacre, the government still classifies certain documents related to Jonestown. Why? What information could be so sensitive that it must remain hidden nearly half a century later? Freedom of Information Act requests have been denied. Researchers have been stonewalled. The official explanation is that releasing these files would compromise intelligence sources and methods. But intelligence operations from the 1970s have long since been declassified. What makes Jonestown different? Some of Jim Jones's own recordings, hours of audio tape documenting life in the compound, remain locked away. What's on those tapes? What did Jones say when he thought no one outside his inner circle would ever hear? The death tape was released, played in courtrooms and documentaries, analyzed by psychologists and historians. But other recordings, perhaps even more revealing, stay hidden in government archives. Survivors live with a burden that never lightens. They ask themselves the impossible question: could they have stopped it? One survivor's voice, recorded years after the tragedy, captures the essence of this guilt. She speaks slowly, carefully, as if each word costs her something. She talks about the signs she ignored, the warnings she didn't heed, the moments when she might have acted but didn't. Her voice cracks when she admits that part of her believed in Jones's vision until the very end. That even as people died around her, some small piece of her wanted to believe he was right. The truth about Jonestown likely lies somewhere in the murky space between mass suicide and mass murder. Some people probably did drink the poison willingly, so thoroughly convinced by Jones's apocalyptic vision that death seemed like transcendence. But many others were certainly killed against their will, forcibly injected or shot while trying to flee. The children, at least 300 of them, had no choice at all. What we're left with are fragments, pieces of a puzzle that may never be completed. We have testimonies that contradict each other, evidence that points in multiple directions, and files that remain sealed for reasons unknown. We have a recorded death scene that is both haunting in its resignation and terrifying in its resistance. We have survivors whose accounts shift over time, perhaps as memory fades, or perhaps as they struggle to make sense of the senseless. The real mystery of Jonestown isn't just what happened on that November day in 1978. It's why our government continues to keep secrets about it. It's how 909 people ended up dead in a jungle clearing, and why we still can't definitively answer whether they were victims of suicide or murder. It's the question that keeps survivors awake at night. At what moment did devotion become destruction? And perhaps most disturbing of all, it's the knowledge that somewhere in a secure facility, recordings of Jim Jones sit in the darkness, his voice preserved on tape, speaking words that someone has decided we're not allowed to hear. What final secrets did he reveal? What truths or lies remain locked away? Until those files are opened, until every recording is released, until every question is answered, Jonestown will remain not just a tragedy, but an unsolved mystery, a wound that refuses to heal, a story that has no ending. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.